So, welcome everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Executive Director of British American Business. We are the leading trade association focused on supporting companies doing business across the New York and London markets. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's session, CMOs on Purpose, brought to you in partnership with Brand Pie, which coincides with the release of their 2020 CEO Purpose Report. Today, with the help of our incredibly seasoned and skilled panel, we will unpack how purpose has helped top marketers continue to drive business performance in a post-COVID world. And to take us through that discussion, it's a privilege for me to introduce you to our moderator today, Mary Lee Sachs. A long-standing member of BAB, Mary Lee is co-founder and US CEO for London-based independent brand consultancy, Brand Pie. Mary Lee has over 25 years experience in marketing and communications. And although she is now based in New York, Mary Lee has spent significant time in Europe, leading international assignments for blue chip brands, including American Express, P&G, and PepsiCo. Mary Lee, it's a pleasure to have you, and over to you.
Thank you, Tamara. Thanks very much, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be kicking this session off today. And before I'd like to get started with some housekeeping rules, you will all be in listen-only mode, and you'll be muted by the host. We intend to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll dedicate some time to Q&A for all of you who are listening in. The chat feature has been turned off, so if you have questions, if you could submit them to the Q&A function, I'd really appreciate it. That would be great. That function is located at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it as you hover over the Zoom menu. We'll monitor and answer the questions throughout the webinar, but apologies now if we don't get to everybody's questions. If we don't, the BAB team will follow up with answers following the session. And I should also mention that the session is being recorded, so that if you would like a copy of the recording afterwards, you can get that on request. So with that, I'd like to kick off to make maximum time for our discussion with John and Frank. I'm going to first introduce our panelists. I'm so excited to have both of them with us today. John Rudowski is partner and global brand and marketing leader for EY. He's based in London. He is a passionate believer in the power of purpose and a believer in the power of ideas and how asking better questions can help change the world. Prior to joining EY 6 years ago, John was CEO of 2 client teams within the world's largest marketing services group. That's WPP, where he consulted for leading public companies Vodafone and GSK on their brand marketing strategy and execution. John's career spans world-class creative agencies and his own entrepreneurial venture. He has global experience across multiple areas, including leading fast-moving consumer goods companies, mobile, electronics, pharmaceutical, and B2B organizations. He's also an early-stage startup advisor and investor. He was born in South Africa, but has also worked in the US and in the UK. Frank Cooper is the Senior Managing Director and Global Chief Marketing Officer for BlackRock. He's based in New York City. Frank has built his career on a unique capability to unite business, human, and cultural perspectives to make brands supremely relevant. As such, he has a reputation as an agent of change. Prior to joining BlackRock 3.5 years ago, Frank was CMO and CCO of media company BuzzFeed, and before that he held marketing leadership roles at PepsiCo for over 13 years. He began his career as an entertainment lawyer, later serving as a senior executive at 2 of the world's most iconic music labels, Motown and Def Jam. More recently, Frank has been lauded by Fast Company as one of the 100 most creative people in business, and is a 4-time recipient of Billboard magazine's Power 100. As well as a recipient of Ad Color's coveted Legend Award. Both EY and BlackRock are members of British American Business. I wanted to mention that because EY is a long-standing member and BlackRock just recently joined. So that's very exciting news. So I'm going to really sort of leap into the questions. Want to get to the whole concept of purpose and really how purpose is helping drive organizations through, has been driving organizations through COVID and now coming into the post-COVID post-pandemic world, we hope, although there seems to be certain issues of it still on the rise in some places. Our second annual survey of CEOs on the subject of purpose highlights the importance of long-term versus short-term, revealing that while 76% of CEOs surveyed believed corporations need to shift focus from the short-term to the longer term, not many are doing that. Less than 5% have made that shift. And they really cite uncertainty about the future as the key reason holding them back. Do you believe that the advent of COVID-19 might change this for the good, or will it just serve to better entrench some of the less bold leaders to become less focused on purpose? John, I'll kick off with you. You're on mute.
Hi everyone, delighted to be here. I mean, as you know at Brand Pie, given your long-standing involvement in that whole subject of purpose, it's a massively complex conversation around it. I think overall I would say that I personally see that this is a moment of acceleration around it at purpose. I think if you look at some of the major trends going on, we've just announced our own mega trends report, which is if you look at this moment in time where technology, where COVID is forcing businesses to take massive changes, who would have thought that studying would be done offline? Who would have thought some of the changes around the world would happen in such speedy terms? So the way I see this is probably there's never been a better time to actually think purpose is going to become real around it. And one of the reasons why I think it gives me huge confidence that it will is even before COVID, you've seen a massive shift in organizations looking at new metrics, because probably the single biggest barrier to the advancement around purpose has been metrics. Most companies have been looking at very short-term measures, as you know. If you look at our own involvement with Project Epic, which is setting new metrics to start to look at long-term value, you start to see a resetting of the role organizations play, but also in terms of the metrics that follow that. I think, you know, going back to your point that 5%, you say, have made that shift. But if you look at the recent Global Business Leaders Roundtable, where we were one of the signatories around that, there's over 200 world CEOs who are looking at that and say, actually, we need to do something about it, and have actually set up a whole new range of metrics. So I think whilst COVID will dislodge many things, I personally think this is a moment of acceleration around those metrics.
Good news, hopefully. What's your view on that, Frank?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I first of all, I understand why there's reluctance and apprehension from the C-suite in thinking long-term. They're often being judged quarter by quarter. You know, if you look at the tenure of CMOs and the tenure of CEOs, there's the perception that their survival and their ability to stay in that seat depends on delivering those quarterly results. And so there's a feeling of safety by focusing on the short term. But I think it's an illusion. And what COVID-19 has done, and I would add in addition to COVID-19, I would add, you know, racial justice 2020. I think those kind of twin forces have changed the way people expect corporations to act and leaders to act. And for me, all crises reveal something that exists before and accelerates it. And I think the same thing has happened here. So what I expect to happen is that in the early phases of the pandemic, you'll see a humanitarian response to it, and that's fine. But as you start to get to the period we're in now, where it starts to stabilize a bit, there's a choice, and I think you'll see divergent responses from CEOs. There's a choice that a leader has to make. Are you going to be on the side of change and leading toward the new world, new normal, the abnormal, whatever's going to come out of this, so that you can emerge stronger, or are you going to hunker down and try to survive? Most of the research shows, even if you look at just recessions, most of the research shows if you play defense only, you will not come out stronger. The odds are that you will come out weakened if you survive at all. And so you have to play both defense and offense. And the offense is inherently long-term at this stage, because the new expectations, the expectations that have been revealed through this crisis, is that people expect corporations to put people and planet over profits. People expect as employees that they deserve to have a sense of fulfillment in their job, and that they're contributing to something larger than themselves, and that their companies have a set of core values that actually help society. I think people expect that companies serve not just shareholders, they serve a broad range of stakeholders. And these things are inherently long-term. In fact, purpose itself is inherently long-term. You cannot be a short-term focused executive and be purpose-driven at the same time.
Makes total sense. We've seen with the advent of the pandemic, some companies pivoting really quickly through this crisis. And at Brand Pie, we've been watching some of the brands and how they repurpose what they do to be more purposeful in how they operate and act as responsible corporate citizens in the environment. And it's been fascinating to see what some of them have done. Can you maybe just give us one prevalent example of how you think purpose has successfully contributed to your organization and how you've been responding to the current crisis in the last 4 to 6 months? Frank, maybe start with you on this one.
Sure. So we went through a couple years ago a massive purpose exercise. We did the archaeological dig of discovering our purpose and then embedding it in the organization. So we were fortunate that we went through that process so that we had a common understanding across the firm of what is our purpose and how do we embed it in the organization. When the crisis hit, we did shift though, and we didn't shift the purpose, we shift the focus among the stakeholders. And the number one stakeholder that we focused on were the employees. We said that our priority at the initial stages will have to be the safety of our employees. Our priority will have to be protecting our employees. And Larry Fink, our CEO, announced that we were not going to lay off any employees as a result of the pandemic. Our focus was on the well-being of our employees. In fact, our purpose statement is that we help more and more people experience financial well-being, and that starts with our employees. And so if you look across the stakeholders that our key stakeholders, our employees became the number one priority by far. And so that was a focus and a shift for us. If you look externally, once we got past the humanitarian crisis and we made donations through our philanthropic arm, once we got past that, we looked at, well, how does our purpose play out among other stakeholders, including customers? And so during that period of instability and uncertainty, we thought that resilience would be critically important. So we started to shift our investment toward that. And the most surprising thing was this, is that we put at the core of our purpose the idea that we would make sustainability our standard. We want to make sustainability the standard in investing. And the surprising thing was people thought that as we went through this crisis, others would take their eye off the sustainability goal. And again, they would hunker down and just hoard money and not invest in these areas. Actually, sustainability has outperformed. And so we've doubled down on sustainability and sustainable investing, and we're seeing our ESG funds outperform. And so those are the two areas, employees, and then shifting our investment focus in a way that can help our clients through the uncertainty and turmoil of this current period.
Great, thank you, Frank. John, how have you seen it play out at EY?
I mean, in some ways, a similar story. I think purpose has been at the heart of EY's journey, talking about building a better working world. About a year ago with a new CEO, we launched what we called the Next Wave strategy, which was a refresh of that purpose. And very much building into it was the concept, the notion of long-term value with really 4 key metrics: people, communities, people, clients, communities, and financial. And I think in many ways that once you've got that very strong, enduring purpose, it became, not dissimilar by the sounds of it, Frank, first and foremost people. And I think, we've seen a lot of that, not just EY. People have obviously, responded to where it matters to people. And I think it's been hugely encouraging based on our purpose, seeing what EY have done, focusing on its people with a range of initiatives and a range of programs to look after them. I think the next thing is obviously clients at a moment like this is really focusing on how we can help our clients. And I think in some ways it's focused the minds on, I think, Frank, you mentioned resilience. Every company has been going through a different moment on that kind of wheel. And we've been talking about content, which is now, next, and beyond. And every organization is trying to navigate from, resilience through to actually the pivot into the beyond. And it was quite actually inspiring to me seeing EY at its best, reacting from a plan that it had into suddenly pivoting and saying, what do our clients need now? What matters to them now? And actually developing a range of initiatives, which is simply out there to help clients navigate through this, because it is, as we know, unprecedented times. And whilst there's a lot of background learning about recessions, frankly, this is on a scale that is also unprecedented. So the next thing was clients. And then communities. I think there's been a massive focus on the work that our people have been encouraged to do. Some formal programs, some informal. We galvanized it around better together, and around the world we've just seen some incredible examples of EY people using blockchain to create new solutions in Italy for helping hospitals, people going out and using their ingenuity to create 3D printing machine for ventilators. So I think really encouraging on the ground support in the communities is just a reflection of that backdrop that, over 300,000 people at EY feel, which is building a better working world needs to be real. And I think if there's one thing I'd say around purpose, having been on this journey for a while, is it's action, not words. And I think that's probably the biggest switch now from a conversation, having seen this over the years, from a conversation as does purpose matter to actually it does, but how do I make it work? How do I action it? And I think in this moment from COVID, and certainly what I've seen at EY, people have been looking to say, how do I make this really meaningful and action against, those kind of core stakeholders?
You both talked about employees there. Sorry, can you hear me now? You both talked about your employees and how important they are to the organization. Our survey found that the #1 challenge CEOs expect to face over the next 5 years is finding the right talent. And I know from conversations I've had with CMOs, it's the same thing. 98% of CEOs surveyed agree that the new generation of talent have different expectations from previous generations, with emotional considerations such as alignment of a company's culture and values, trumping benefits like flexible working, training, and access to technology, although a lot of those things will just have happened because of the work from home situation that we find ourselves in now. How does this factor into how you think about purpose for your own organization, and how does it factor into not just enterprise-wide, but also from a marketing perspective as well?
Yeah, I feel like the future is in good hands. I love this next generation of talent because they're saying we deserve money, we deserve status, but we also deserve the sense of fulfillment in our job, right? We deserve to have this feeling that we are contributing to something bigger than ourselves, and the best talent is now insisting on it. In virtually every interview that I've had with new talent coming in, the question of what are our values, what is the culture, how does the company contribute to something beyond profits has come up in virtually every interview. And I think it's fantastic. But the key is this: you can't think that I'm going to give you purpose, employee X, therefore I'll pay you less. Not going to happen. I'm going to give you purpose, employee Y, but you know what? We're not going to give you any sense of status. Those two things stay in place. The question is, how do you make purpose real with the employee? And that's the hard part. And John, you touched on this idea. I think the companies that are on the leading edge of this, they are moving from identifying their purpose to how do I actually make it real? How do I embed it in the organization, and how do I externalize it? And so what we've done is we've done a couple of things. One, we put together a series of exercises and meetings to allow each employee to understand their own personal sense of purpose and how to connect that to the company purpose. We did that with all 15,000 employees. And it's a tough process because you do it the first time, you go through it, people typically will say, well, I like to ski, I like to play basketball, they get their hobbies. But as they go through it, they get deeper and deeper, and they find out what are the things that energize them. And once they identify that and find a way to connect that to the company's purpose, and that could be through their immediate job, it could be through a employee network, it could be through social impact programs, but they find that connection, that sense of fulfillment and connection to the company deepens exponentially. And so we've done that piece of it. I think that was a critical part of connecting talent to it. But it unlocks something else that I didn't expect. The thing that it unlocks is, I actually believe now the pathway to really making empathy real within a company is to allow employees to actually make that connection. Because when you identify who you are, what motivates you, what energizes you, connected to your sense of purpose, you then can apply empathy in a much more effective way. I don't know how anyone can be truly empathetic over the long term without knowing himself or herself. And so this exercise that we conducted helped with that. But Mary Lee, it's an ongoing thing. What I've learned so far is that it's not a one and done process. It's not like you go through the rounds, and it could be a year-long process. And John's right, it's not about putting posters up in the office and repeating the statement at all. It really is about this ongoing process of self-discovery and finding that connection between who you are and connecting it to the firm's purpose. And I think we're now just starting to see the benefits of that. And hopefully more companies will start to do that also.
Right. John, do you want to talk about what you do at EY?
Certainly the purpose has been set front and center for both retaining, people at EY, but also attracting new talent. And I think I've read this, every study, and yours really endorses that, is, people are looking for a career where they can contribute beyond themselves. So I think it's then a question of what do you do and how do you allow people to fulfill that one. And again, across EY, a range of different programs around that. We've actually recently rolled out around the concept "It's yours to build," which is, as an organization, we have a range of different ways in which people can fulfill their purpose as an individual, but be a bit more in control about the choices they make to contribute to our overall purpose. And then, all sorts, as you said, Frank, similarly, there's personal purpose, but then there's the ability to actually drive change. We have a program called Ripples, which is our ambition really to affect change in society around us, entrepreneurs, next generation talent, and there's a range of programs that help individuals go out and help different organizations. In fact, there's a plan to try and impact 1 billion lives over the years through these programs, through the scale of EY being able to impact so much. So I think it's important to say, there's purpose, but there is also, as you've put in your own study, that flexible working, training, education. I think people are looking, obviously, financial remuneration, but they're looking for experiences, and I think that's another part of It's Yours to Build, is that the investment in training. We have a huge badge training program where people can actually continuously demonstrate advancement through training and education. So I think if I call them some of the more traditional exercises an organization needs to do in terms of developing employment, I'd say that's accelerated. And then if you add this element around purpose to actually, use your skills to affect change in the world through the work you do, is the power of that combination.
Great. I'm going to take one of the questions that we've had coming live from one of our attendees anonymously, so I don't know who's asked the question. Have you had to adjust how you build and project your brand as a result of COVID-19? And do you have any practical advice on how we should think about these things? I don't know if one of you would like to pick that up. John?
Frank's, you're still on mute. I'll go, Frank. I think, I think in common with many folk, there's a point where, you have plans and then you pause them. And so I don't think there's a business that has not taken a deep breath at that moment to kind of pause and go, okay, what do we need to do? I think, from our point of view, and I think it's probably true of many B2B marketers as well as B2B, the focus around how do we add value externally. I think that's been a central guiding question is, the audience, people are time poor, they're at home juggling family for the first time, probably teaching their children as well. So if you're going to communicate, make sure it's purposeful, make sure it's got meaning, and make sure it's relevant to your audience. I think, in some ways, those are truisms of all good marketing, actually, but in a time of crisis like that, there's probably the biggest single focus is, will this truly add value to my audience to help them as they're in that crisis? So it's really forced a kind of outward in moment. And I think the other thing is empathy. I think it's been a daily conversation to say, is what we're doing right for the audience? I think, again, it's true holistically. We always say be empathetic to your audience, but at this moment, it's really making sure that you have your antenna out to say, is this, again, I'm sure like you've seen some great examples where brands have done some really extraordinary things, and then you've seen some brands who look like nothing's happened in the world while they're still trying to sell their wares as if the world is just carrying on. So I think empathy is important. I suppose the final thing is, inspiration. I do think that brands at a moment like this have a role to kind of remind people of humanity, to remind people of the good that's going on. And so, we do share some of the stories around our purpose, the big and small actions, some of that I mentioned, because, one great inspirational story inspires someone else. And so I think, brands have always had a role to play in people's lives. And so I think inspiration, adding value, empathy, and inspiration somewhere is quite important.
Yeah, John, I agree with what you're saying, and it's pretty much in line how we think about it. I go back to the point earlier. A crisis reveals, and so one of the things that it revealed was that a maniacal focus on the industry and on a subset of stakeholders, whether that's shareholders and clients only, is no longer tenable. And so for us, the brand shift really starting with the cultural lens, not the industry lens. What is happening in the world? And John, to your point, how can we actually help people? And the metric is, how many people have we helped and by how much? And when you start from that cultural lens, you have a broader view. You're no longer trapped in especially for B2B companies that define themselves as B2B. You're no longer trapped in the language or the scope of how you could impact people. And so for me, that's been the primary shift, shifting to the cultural lens first. And so we're starting with teasing out insights, gathering data. How are people, what do people need to actually make their lives better? And how can what we do contribute to that? And the reason purpose becomes important, because the third leg of that is, coming from culture to the industry, is how does your firm differentiate itself within that? Your core operations, how can you do your part in advancing people's lives? And so it is a pretty fundamental shift for those who have been purely industry focused, and those who are using that language, and those who have a narrow view of stakeholders. It's a dramatic shift. We were already down that path, but it has been accelerated. And you should be able to tell, first and foremost, by the language we use. We're using much more we language in how we're communicating. We're talking more about big ideas, and we're tackling bigger questions like sustainability. How can we make the world a more sustainable place? How can sustainable investing contribute to that? It's a dramatic shift in the overall brand for us. And I think this is only going one way, and that is brands that really matter. And I think that you'll see a dichotomy. I think you'll see brands that will be just product names masquerading as brands, and brands that actually have kind of deep resonance for people, and that really add value to their lives, and that help them shape their both their individual identity and their collective identity. But most important, they actually add value within the cultural spaces in which they operate. And so I think this has been building for years. We're now at that inflection point, and those brands who have done some of that work can accelerate. Those who haven't need to quickly identify what they stand for beyond profits. They need to quickly develop a lens on what's happening in culture, and then work back into the industry and apply what they do effectively to that.
John.
Just to add to that, because everything you said, I wholeheartedly agree. I think the other thing is that companies are realizing it's not about purpose or profits is actually in the future, you will not have the profits without actually understanding the wider context. And that's probably the biggest shifting equation in all of this one. It won't be a luxury because customers won't buy your brand. You won't attract the right talent. So it's actually it's not, the old thing is, do you need, you know, profits or purpose? It's actually, unless you have a purpose, you will not have the profits you want in the future.
So organizations and executives tend to define purpose differently. We're starting to find that it's coming together a little bit, but still not. Sometimes purpose gets confused with philanthropy. Sometimes it gets confused with ESG goals. And Frank, you've mentioned ESG a couple of times. With the global wave of support for Black Lives Matter, I'm going to go straight into a societal issue at the moment. How do you view the role of purpose on weighing in on such an important issue or other social issues that are particularly divisive?
Yeah, so for me, I would first separate purpose from ESG. ESG, as I understand it, is an outgrowth of CSR, of corporate social responsibility. It's primarily focused on financial performance and how environmental and social factors and governance can affect financial performance. And there are a bunch of metrics that have come out from that, from SASB to GRI to UN Sustainable Development Goals. To me, purpose is much more foundational to the firm. It is not looking at solely what's happening in the world and then what can I do? It's first starting, who are we? Why do we exist? What's our reason for being? And that becomes your ultimate goal. Profits becomes an output from that, but it becomes your ultimate goal. This is why we exist in the world and how we add value to people and to society and to the planet. And so for me, that's the hard work that has to be done first. Then you apply it to the E, S, and G. And the S piece, including Black Lives Matter, the S piece is messy because social factors includes a wide range of things. You know, it is labor rights, it is racial equality, it is LGBTQ, it is wealth inequality. It's a wide range of things, and you can just throw a dart at it and say that's what we're going to tackle, or you could kind of put your ear to the ground and say this is what people are worried about, so let me tackle that. But a more effective approach would be, what are we here to do, and then how can we apply it against the most urgent issues within the E and the S. And so I believe, though, that the reason I said there's two pandemics happening, there's COVID-19 and racial justice 2020, I believe that this current momentum we're seeing around Black Lives Matter, again, has been bubbling under for quite some time. And in fact, if you look back to January, we're tracking some of this data, you look at social media, the question of inequality and race was like a hockey stick, just took off. And it's not new, it's been around for a long time, but it took off because it became, COVID-19 revealed again that there was a disproportionate impact on Black communities, on Black people in general. And that raised the conversation, but most importantly, it raised the consciousness of people. And ironically, the thing that raised the consciousness more than anything was not a piece of data. You know, it wasn't a purpose statement. It wasn't ESG metrics. It was the video. It was the camera on the phone. You know, the video on the phone. That's what changed everything, because then people could actually feel and see what had been discussed for quite some time. You know, that the disparate treatment of certain groups is representative of anyone who feels vulnerable across the world. Any group that feels vulnerable can relate to that. And I think that's why you're seeing this multiracial, multi-ethnic, cross-geography coalition standing up to this idea of racial inequity. And so I believe that the S in ESG will continue to rise. I think the S in ESG, and this doesn't mean that the E will be diminished. Environmental sustainability will continue, but the social factors have now become front and center because it affects everything. Environmental sustainability has a disproportionate impact on communities of color and communities that have less wealth. It affects everything. And so I believe that we're going to see a rise in the S, that it will continue. This is not a temporary blip. I think the companies now that want to be on the leading edge of purpose and leading edge of ESG will have to, unfortunately, tackle the more complex problem of social factors and environmental and governance. And the only way they can unify that, I think, is to have a clear sense of their purpose and to behave consistently around that purpose.
Thank you. Great, well put. I'm going to go to a question that we have from the audience, from Ian Wood. A little bit provocative here. Haven't all successful brands throughout time had at their heart what we would now call a purpose, but never formalized? And perhaps this is the most obvious with brands with clear owners or founders who are involved.
John, you want to answer that? You want? Yeah.
Some of the most enduring companies, I would totally agree, have had them. I'm never allowed to mention names, but I worked on some before where, you know, fundamentally the impact to the societies in which they operated were fundamental. They've been written in stone around the impact to the total stakeholders. So you're absolutely right. You know, some of the greatest companies have put purpose at the heart, but most haven't. And I think what you've seen, particularly if you look at where this purpose conversation really accelerated, probably about 7 years ago, I'd say. I'm looking at Brand Pie because I know that was certainly the journey you started working with EY at that point. Is it's accelerated because actually there was a lack of purpose beyond profit. And if you go back to the preceding 10 or 20 years, it was profit probably at the expense of many other things. So I think there has been a sea change around it. And for the last 7 years, I mean, having been lucky to attend every Davos for the past few years, the conversation has, you know, as I've said, gone beyond, is it important to actually, how do we make it happen? And so I think the other thing I'd say is if you look at many entrepreneurs, particularly the sort of so-called Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, they probably have started more with a greater sense of purpose. So I think some of the startup organizations have been founded on purpose, probably more so. But I think there's this huge array of companies in the middle that have been having to go through this journey from being beholden to quarterly reports to actually say, how do I actually build purpose into the organization? So I think there is a shift.
Yeah, I think there's a dramatic shift. You know, we're now used to hearing about companies like Tom's Shoes or Warby Parker, or half of Silicon Valley would post on their walls all the great ways in which they're contributing to the world. You can question whether or not all of them have fulfilled that. But I think there's been a dramatic shift. And I'll go much further back. If you go all the way back, you know, to the late 19th century, all the way to the middle of the 20th century, brands were almost purely about functionality. All they talked about was, and features and benefits. They talked about, my soap works. You know, I have fluoride in my toothpaste. You know, I'll add these features, and here's how they will benefit you. You fast forward to the 80s, it was all about image. It was Jordache jeans and BMWs for yuppies. It was all about image. And it wasn't really until the dawn of the 21st century that we started talking about brands as really contributing to something much larger. It started in the 90s, but it really picked up in the 21st century. And the main shift for me is this, and this is why I think it is a fundamental shift, as John, as you mentioned, is that it's no longer just about a customer. Yeah, it's about something much bigger than the customer. It's about playing in a broad cultural space. It's identifying cultural groupings that transcend race and gender and geography. It's about how you're adding value to those spaces. And once you move to that space, you're no longer just talking about brand, you're talking about brand and reputation. And those two things now, I think, have converged. And so I believe it's a fundamental shift in what we're seeing in terms of how a brand presents itself around purpose. And it's a long way off from the functionality piece of it. I'll leave you with one last thing on this. Because some people may think that, wow, now I can just do purpose and I'm all good. Unfortunately, you still have to have a product that functions. People still want an innovative brand, so they want to have new features and benefits. Image still does matter some, you know, so people want to see it, but they don't want it to be a hollow image. And now you have to deliver purpose. Yes, it's harder. It's more complex, but those will be the brands I think that will thrive going forward.
So to your point about it's harder, we have another question from Duncan Edwards. Has your purpose caused you to do things that might not have been done before, that have actually cost the firm? Is purpose only really tested when it means lost business or lower margin?
I believe purpose is only tested when you have that conflict, when you have a moment in which you might trade off short-term profit by making a choice to fulfill and exercise your purpose. That to me is the ultimate test. And so if you are CVS and someone says, well, your purpose is to become a health company, right? That's what you're saying, a community-based health company. And I look behind the counter and I see rows and rows of cigarettes. How do you reconcile that? And you have to give CVS a lot of credit because they said, you know what, you're absolutely right. And they pulled it off the shelf. It may have had something to do with the merger with Aetna, but let's put that aside for a second. But they had the courage to do it and say that I will sacrifice short-term profit in order to fulfill my purpose. And by the way, they made up that profit by shifting toward purpose-driven activities like smoking cessation approaches, expanding their community clinics. And so they actually made up that lost profit within, I believe it was 18 months or so. So that is the ultimate test, I believe, if you're going to trade off profits for it. But you don't always have to trade off profits. To me, the idea of purpose, and John, you touched on this earlier, is that it opens up new profit pools. When you start to think about how your purpose can be applied, you're not just saying this in the abstract, I just want to do generic good. You're saying there's a need in the world that can be fulfilled by our expertise, by our infrastructure and capabilities, our technology. And that if there's really a need in the world, people will pay for that. There is profit within purpose.
I think it's a fair question, and it's true. Things cost you, that's a test of it. I also think that question sometimes prevents organizations from going down the journey of purpose because they worry about some Achilles heel or some issue down the line. And I think what we've often done, and we've seen, working with clients, is actually taking them on a journey and taking steps forward. I think that it's a dangerous thing when you start to worry too much about that question because then you don't take steps forward. So I think,
We have a question here, and it was actually one of my questions worded in a slightly different way. How do you know when your purpose is resonating? And I wanted to ask you, how do you measure the effectiveness of having a purpose?
I mean, we've tracked internal engagement scores, which, since launching EY's purpose, they've continued to rise. We look at client surveys in terms of the relevance of building a better working world and its motivation amongst the clients. And again, we see, huge traction with that. And then we've looked at our results. If you look at the story of EY over the years in terms of its growth trajectory, it's been hugely successful. So I think those are just some of the metrics around, internal engagement, external engagement, and ultimately the success of the organization. And talent, we touched on that earlier, certainly in terms of the ability to attract talent because our purpose is very tangible.
Yeah, it's a very tough question. The question of measuring the impact of purpose, and I mentioned it earlier. I think we get some ways down the line with SASB, Sustainable Accounting Board, and GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, or measuring against UN Sustainable Development Goals. You get somewhere down the line, but it's not that satisfactory because it's not specific enough to direct the action and resources of a company. And so I think we're going to see new metrics, and the metrics I believe will be measured across the different stakeholders, from employees to customers to communities, I think to shareholders. We'll see a range of metrics, and right now the only thing I see that's working, and this has to change, is that each company has to develop its own benchmark about where they are with each of those stakeholders, and then develop some goals of progress. What I would love to see is a broader coalition, where we get together and much like SASB did, it took Gene Rogers, 12 years or so to put together the SASB standards. But to develop a set of standards across stakeholders that we can start to compare with each other. I think it's going to require, no one company is going to solve it, but to take the initial step, I would say just look at your stakeholders, decide what progress looks like, benchmark where you are today, and set some goals of progress. But John, hopefully you and I and many others will get together and we'll start to formulate some standards that are widely accepted.
Absolutely, and I think the good news, as you know, is there are a number. The community of Davos, the Big Four, they're looking at different messages around governance, people, the planet, and prosperity. So I think there are, but as you say, I think the ideal will be with a common set of metrics. But your practical advice, which is if you work out who your total stakeholder groups are, then you can set your own metrics of progress.
Great question here from Richard Thompson. For brands who have recently defined their purpose, who do they need to build belief in it first? Employees, customers, or their investors?
For me, that's a very clear answer. It's the employees. I think purpose only happens from the inside out and the bottom up. It falls apart very, very quickly if you have a set of senior executives who say, this is our purpose. I want everyone to memorize it. This is where we're going out to the market with it. Now repeat it. You have to John made this point earlier, you have to live it. And the test is no longer what you say, it's what you do. It's a world where actions are greater than words. And you can't get someone to think their way into it. They only make their way into it through a very personal and emotional connection. And so it starts with the employees and finding that connection. And as I mentioned earlier, that is the pathway to empathy. And if you want to be customer-centric, empathy is going to be absolutely critical. So inside out, bottom up, employees first, and then move on to the external side.
John, do you have anything you want to add?
It's beautifully put, Frank. So I don't think I can top that one. I think the only additional one, which is Dave Allen, who, as you know, is the founder of Brand Pie. I remember being at the same speech as him many years ago from the CEO of a former client of ours. And it's probably the best definition I've ever heard of a brand, which is a brand is what a brand does. And actually, very much we take that to heart at EY, which is it's the actions you take that defines your brand. And wholeheartedly, Frank, I think brands today need to start from the inside out. I think without that, the rest doesn't follow.
So I have an interesting question here from Gerard Critchlow. And I think that it's trying to get to how to define a purpose for an organization. That's probably a whole nother panel of it in and of itself. But what cultural trends are you tracking, and how are you linking those cultural trends to commercial realities?
I mean, I'd say, it's an interesting question. I was going to say, I thought you were going to offer your services for Empire. but look, I think, from a trend point of view, certainly from a commercial point of view, we've just launched what I briefly mentioned is the mega trends that fundamentally society in the world is going through a number of big changes from technology, cities. So, again, I would urge you to go and look at our own platform around some of the mega trends. So I think one has to look future back, as we say, into what's happening in the world in the future and then how you navigate there. I suppose I would just say that going a little bit back to that conversation of brand purpose, I would say in defining your purpose, I think you really need to start at the business level. I think brands are a reflection of the business, not the other way around. So I think that for me, the hard work is actually engineering what is the business purpose, and then the brand part is kind of easy to do, dare I say it, but you can't do it the other way around.
Yeah, and I agree. And look, I guess this answer will vary industry to industry and company to company, but we're probably on the broad cultural space, we're probably tracking the same thing that many other companies are tracking. We're tracking what's happening in environmental sustainability. We're tracking what's happening in the area of mental health. That is has been rising rapidly over the past 5 to 7 years. We're tracking how artificial intelligence will affect jobs and job security, and they need to adapt the skill set and knowledge for workers. We're tracking what's happening in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I put into that the whole racial inequity piece, but if you look at it on a global scale, this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion is really about people saying that how am I included in the prosperity that I see only a few people enjoying? And so out of that, you start to see things like the populist movement, nationalistic behavior, deglobalization. And so it spins off into a bunch of different subsets, subset areas. But within financial services, the areas that I've been tracking the closest are, number one, people's relationship with money. We've worked on financial literacy forever, and people have talked about financial literacy being the unlock. Unfortunately, financial literacy in its traditional sense only changes behavior by 0.1%. Doesn't change anything. And so, but it doesn't mean that financial literacy is not worthwhile. It means that we probably have not found the right way in. And I think what people are looking for is, what should my relationship with my money be? How do I reduce stress? How much is enough? How do I earn, spend, save, invest, and give money in ways that give me a greater sense of fulfillment? We think that's a whole rich area coming out of culture, but we think it's also within our industry. And then the last one will be retirement. We're looking very closely at retirement. We think the whole notion of retirement has to evolve. People are living longer with less money, and people are taking on-ramps and off-ramps throughout their entire career. And no one's looking at 65 as the end date. And especially no one's saying, you know what, I'll just toil until 65. And then, man, at that point, I can start enjoying life. No one's saying that, right? And so we think this era of retirement, again, coming out of culture, offers some significant opportunities for us to reimagine what that means. And we think that will offer up some business opportunities, but also will deliver value to people.
So I've had a great question for both of you. You're both in international global roles. Does the idea of purpose resonate equally with employees around the world, or do you need to adopt a tailored approach to building understanding and belief?
It's a human condition, as I see it, that people want to feel like they're contributing to something bigger than themselves. It's a human condition that people want a greater sense of fulfillment. It's a human condition that to have sustained performance, what you do needs to energize you. So on that level, it is global. How it manifests itself and the expectations that people have differ by region and differ by country. You can see massive differences in terms of optimism throughout Asia, for example. You can see, John, where you guys are in Western Europe, I see more pessimism, more kind of entrenched, but the expectation is still there. You just have to craft it in a way that taps into that cultural perspective that each region and each country really has. But the underlying kind of human condition and human yearning exists everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a human truth. I mean, to actually contribute to the world. I mean, I think if you look at any study, any psychology, that is a basic human need and a human state. But as you say, Frank, it's the execution of that, the way you adapt it, the way you make it relevant, and again, the different programs, if you like. If you look at it at a program level, it might vary. But in terms of overall galvanizing, certainly, I see it from EY's point of view, but pretty much any other brand organization I've ever worked with, is if you play to a human truth, it will work pretty much anywhere in the world. I think the only thing that doesn't tend to work the same around the world is humor when it comes to advertising. But other than that, I think if you play to the heart, then you can enroll anyone.
I have one last question before I hand back to Tamra, and it actually builds on the question we just had, and it's from Colin Wheeler. How advanced, if that's the appropriate word, are consumers globally in their expectations of corporations, companies, and brands in delivering purposeful positioning and delivery? So, what are the consequences for those companies that don't deliver longer term? So we've just talked about the internal stakeholders. What about the sort of external consumer market?
Hey, Colin. I mean, if you look at pretty much every study, consumers are making choices based on an organization's environmental footprint. They are making choices about the way they contribute to society. And I think, as we've heard in this session, that's going to only escalate, not de-escalate. So I think, in a strange way, there's a huge push and pull from consumers. And that will continue. I think it's also true that governments as well. I mean, I think, we often talk about governments, but I think governments are also being forced by consumers into affecting change for their own community. So I think my simple answer is absolutely. I think we're going to see increasingly that consumers drive the change for organizations to push them forward.
Right.
Yeah, and look, I think that people often say that customers complain, but they don't really change very much. They may say, I won't buy this product because they're doing something I don't like, but they never follow through. I think we're seeing that change actually happen now for a few reasons. One, I think social media and the messaging apps have changed that. They've allowed people to combine their voices in ways that they know they can actually effect change. But also, I think the cultural currency of today is to stand up and to change the systems that they believe have not benefited enough people. That to me has been the most dramatic shift that I've seen over the past year or so, is that we've shifted from people, customers, looking at proximate causes. Like, this is something that happened, let's attack that one issue, to looking at the systems that underlie those proximate causes. And so I think what we're going to see over the next several years is that a more concerted effort to shape the behavior of brands, shape the behavior of companies, coming from customers as well as other stakeholders.
Great, thank you. John, did you want to add something else?
I was going to say, and if you look at a number of studies, that increasingly customers are expecting CEOs to take a point of view publicly on these issues, given the impact that a corporation can have in the society. So I think it is definitely on the rise, not lessened.
And John, what's interesting about that is that the risk of inaction may be greater than the risk of action in that sense, right?
Absolutely true. I think historically, leaders were scared, but now it's actually, if you're not out there, there might be more reputational damage. Absolutely.
So purpose is here to stay and hopefully increase in importance. Thank you both. That was a fantastic session. And I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Tamara now, who I believe is going to close the session.
Thank you, Mary Lee.
Thank you. A huge, humble thank you to you, Mary Lee, for taking us through the session today, and to John and Frank for taking some time out of your schedules. It's an incredibly important topic, and we'll look forward to continue to see how this journey of purpose continues. Our programming journey continues as well at British American Business. We have many more webinars and virtual programs coming up in July. So if you'd like to know more about the work we're doing, please do feel free to be in touch. In the meantime, thank you all for joining. And again, Mary Lee, John, Frank, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks for listening.